No Longer Human by Osamu Dazai is a novel that explores the inner life of Obayazo, the main character of the story, a man who feels fundamentally disconnected from humanity. The novel is written in a confessional style, allowing readers to access the protagonist's thought, fears, and emotional struggles. So, this study analyzes the novel using a trauma theory approach to understand the psychological causes behind Yozo's alienation and loss of identity. Next is the background of the text. No Longer Human is set in pre and post war Japan, reflecting a period of social instability and identity crisis happened in Japan during that time. So the novel is semi-autobiographical based on Dazai's, the author's, own struggles with depression, addiction, and suicide attempts. Next is the authors. Osamu Dazai was a prominent Japanese writer known for themes of despair, alienation, and self-destruction. His personal experience strongly influenced the psychological depth and realism of the protagonist throughout the novel. Next, the major themes include the alienation from society, loss of identity, psychological trauma, masking and performative behavior. So, this theme make the novel suitable for trauma theory analysis. Next is the problem statement. The protagonist, Obayazo, perceives himself as disqualified from being human, but the psychological reason behind this perception are not clearly explained within the text. So many readings focus on existential despair or social failure without deeply analyzing Yozo's own trauma experiences. So the research gap that we went through is most analyzers treat these issues as individual psychological problems rather than interpreting them as responses to unresolved trauma. That's why our study aims to examine No Longer Human through the lens of trauma theory in order to better understand how unresolved trauma shape users' psychological alienation and fragmented sense of identity.
No Longer Human by Osamu Dazai is a semi-autobiographical novel that portrays the theme of alienation, identity crisis, and the psychological struggle of an individual within society. The novel is widely considered as part of the I novel, where the writer turns the self into the story. The protagonist of the novel, Oba Yozo, represents the author himself, where Yozo's experience in the novel closely reflect the author's personal struggles, feelings, and emotion. Through this semi-biographical writing, the novel portrays the inner psychological and existential struggles that Daza experienced himself, allowing the readers to understand the difficulties and struggles faced by Dazai, which is portrayed by Yozo's story. This enables the reader to immerse themselves in the author's inner life while maintaining the narrative distance of fiction. Many scholarly discussions emphasize alienation as the novel's central theme, which is a condition where an individual feels out of place or isolated within society. Napier 2005 and Suzuki 2012 in their studies argue that Yozo's sense of being is unfit for human life, where Yozo found himself unable to engage with society and isolated from those around him. He performs clownery as a coping mechanism to survive in society and avoid rejection. Fauzi et al. 2025 state that Yozo's persistent sense of being other indicates not only a refusal to society but also a profound inability to adapt to the established society norms. This view aligns with broader descriptions of alienation that locate it not only in personal psychological landscape, but also embedded in post-war cultural flux and identity dislocation. Ramadisa and Fabrian 2025. Malik 2025 in his studies discussed identity fragmentation through psychoanalytic and existential views. He states that the novel's narrative technique, which is the structure and style, highlights how fragmentation portrays the chaotic mental state of Yozo. The fragmented storytelling in voice, forms, and perspective reflects Yozo's internal breakdown. The jumbled and shifting narrative of the novel represents Yozo's disintegrating self, in which his sense of identity is falling apart and losing its unity. This aligns with the findings of Yoananto et al. 2025, which state that Yozo's persona and shadow has coexist within himself, resulting the confliction of his side, including his inner consciousness. This affects his mental state, which leads him to emotional collapse. Kisha 2024 in her studies argues on Yozo's awareness of his life absurdity and inability to socialize. She stresses on how Yozus not actually fails to understand the absurdity of his life, but he does understand it too well and does absolutely nothing about it. Yozus' repeated declaration of being unfit for human life emphasized that he has already been stripped of social norms. While Yozo was not rebelling against it, yet he chose to collapse inward, which is clowning himself in order to avoid commitment and responsibility. In terms of existentialism, Yozo is free, yet he is terrified to that freedom. This led to how Yozo chose his self-destruction to escape from the problem. Despite the extensive scholarly attention, several gaps remain in the existing literature. While alienation and psychological struggle are widely discussed, their relationship with trauma theory remains underexplored. They also compasses self-negation, emotional numbness, and repetitive self-destructive cycles strongly resonate with concepts from trauma theory. Next, we can also see how feminism theory are not getting attention. Yozo's claim of being unfit for human life often being the center of readers' attention, while the women who support and love him are normalized as part of his story arc. The female suffering becomes voiceless, consumed by Yozo's self-story, without getting recognition as its own form of marginalization.
Hello, my name is Nur Ali Shafika, and I will be presenting the 5 theories that we have used to analyze the book No Longer Human. So, the first theory that we have used is the unclaimed experience by Kathy Caruth. So, Caruth states that trauma does not present in the form of a complete narrative, but appears through repetition, delayed understanding, and silence in the narrative. So, through this theory, uh, Carew states that in a narrative, the past of a character continuously erupts to the character's present, which means that the trauma from the past will constantly reappear in the present of a present experience of a character. But it may not be fully understood by the character, as the character may have not processed the trauma yet. But the trauma is never directly mentioned, but it is always implied through actions and behavior. So I would like to use this use the book as an example for this theory. So Yozo Oba's notebook-based structure is written in a first-person perspective. So we are able to see Yozo Oba's thought process and how he navigates his trauma of childhood sexual abuse. He never mentions this trauma explicitly in the book, but there is repeated behavior caused by the trauma, which strengthens Caru's theory about how trauma is never directly mentioned, but there is actions that shows that it is caused by the trauma, such as Yozo's alcoholism, drug abuse, and suicide attempts. So the second theory that we have used in this book is the return of the repressed by Sigmund Freud. This is a core Freudian concept in trauma theory, where Freud states that repressed material is reproduced not as memory but as action. Trauma is acted out rather than directly recalled. So this shows that trauma. He states that trauma is preserved in the unconscious brain, but it constantly reappears in consciousness, but in distorted forms of behavior. It is it mostly appears under pressure, but it is to hide unwanted emotions such as shame and fear. Yozo Oba clearly shows this proves this theory through a lot of his actions to hide his shame and fear for not being human enough. So one of the examples that we can see is this clowning behavior to hide his depression, even though that it does more harm than good, and his tendency to resort to alcohol as a numbing agent to try to repress the trauma that he has because he is unable to process it. So it shows that he never really directly recalls his past trauma in his childhood, but it always is acted out in distorted behaviors that only does more harm to himself than benefit him. So the third theory is another Freudian trauma theory concept, which is the repetition compulsion. So Freud states that the repetition compulsion is the survivor's inability to discuss traumatic events and may be doomed to reenact it compulsively again. So when we say that they are doomed to reenact the trauma again, it does not necessarily exactly reenact the trauma that they have experienced, but the patterns and behavior that are caused by it. Usually, when they repeat an action or behavior, it is usually not for enjoyment, but attempts to master handling the issue when they have when they have never processed it or they struggle to handle it at the past. And usually, this behavior does more harm than good to the character or the victim, and it perpetuates a self destructive cycle that they struggle to break free from because they have never processed the trauma that they have experienced. So, one example from Yozo Oba is that he uses alcohol to numb the trauma of his childhood. And while it allows him to function normally in a social situation, it is only temporary, and worse, it falls him deeper into shame and depression. And but rather than breaking free or not using alcohol anymore, he still repeats the behavior because he struggles to do anything else because he has never processed that trauma and how the alcohol only does more pain than good to him. So the fourth theory that we have used is acting out versus working through by Dominic Lacapra, in which Lacapra states that acting out is the tendency to repeat something compulsively due to trauma, while working through is the countervailing force, which means these are the two modes where a victim would act while experiencing trauma. So acting out usually means where the victim's past and present constantly collide in their minds, and they repeatedly acts on harmful behavior because of it. And while repeating these acts of harmful behavior, they also continuously experience fragmented memories of the events. So when they constantly have flashbacks of this trauma, they act out because they cannot differentiate the past and the present of that trauma. While for working through the trauma, it means it's an effort to distance the past events from the present events. So the character attempts to break free from that trauma, distance themselves from it, so they can work through the issues that they have experienced, which is very difficult to achieve, but it is very necessary to help them heal through that trauma. So in Yozo's situation, in No Longer Human, he always acts out in the story, but he always fails at working through that trauma. And you can see that he indulges in the harmful behaviors such as suicide attempts and alcoholism as a way of acting out that trauma. And he always described his past experience as the present, as how it defines him. Yes, he acknowledges his issues as him not understanding himself and the society, and acknowledges that he is suffering, but he lets it define him instead of working through it, which means while he has only minimal ways of working through, but it never goes further than acknowledging his actions and behavior. The last theory that we have used to analyze the text of No Longer Human is testimony by Feldman and Lau. Testimony is the crisis of witnessing historical events. It consists of bits and pieces of a memory that has been overwhelmed. So, based on this theory, it says that trauma resists from being addressed directly. Uh, when a victim tries to tell a story, the narratives are very fragmented, silenced, or very unstable. Testimony is not only a retelling of facts, but bearing witness to an absence, which means that it is a record or proof of events that has happened. And a testimony occurs before understanding the traumatic event, which is why the narratives are very fragmented, because they are still unable to process that trauma yet. But the events has happened. So in No Longer Human, Yozo bears witness to his own depressing life. He writes his own story even before understanding it. So he does not. It shows this narrative where he does not write his life clearly, but is very fragmented with uneven emotions in the text. He fails to interpret his own traumatic experiences while narrating it, as in he never addresses his trauma, always dancing around it, and he never gains insight from writing down his testimony, as in he always says that he is suffering, or he does not he does not understand himself or others, and alienating himself. But even after writing this testimony, he never seems to understand his own suffering.
Next is the novel analysis based on trauma theory, where we'll examine how overwhelming experiences that resist immediate comprehension will shape Yozo's fractured identity, his compulsive behavior, as well as his narrative point of view. Firstly is the analysis based on trauma as an unassimilated experience. From the novel, Yoso had stated, to perpetrate such a thing on a small child is the ugliest, vilest, and cruelest crime a human being can commit. But I endured it. Yozo's earlier traumatic experience, mainly his childhood sexual abuse, were not processed emotionally and narratively as they had occurred, but instead appear at a later moment in the story as fragmented and emotionally distant reference. The trauma is not recalled as a continuous memory, but is seen as a psychological scar that will determine Yozo's subsequent fear of other human beings, his loss of confidence in human intimacy, as well as his sense of profound alienation. Next is the analysis based on repression and the return of the repressed. From the novel, Yozo had stated, this was how I happened to invent my clowning. It was the last quest for love I was to direct at human being. Rather than being able to consciously remember or voice out his traumatic experience, he also had repressed them and pushed them out of his awareness. But as Freud had mentioned, the act of repressing such event will not erase the trauma. Rather, it will make the traumatic material emerge through indirect behaviors and symptoms. This could be seen in Yozo compulsive clowning. The third analysis is based on repetition compulsion and self-destructive cycle. Throughout the novel, we could see that Yozo had lived his life through a vicious cycle of self-destructive behaviors
alcoholism, drug addiction, exploitative relationship, and endless social failures. Although he knows and admitted his fear of human being, which could be seen in the line, I have always shook with fright before human beings. Fioso kept on doing things that could harm himself and constantly put himself in a situation where he is made to feel worthless and excluded, hence further enhancing his fear of human being. Next is the analysis based on acting out versus walking through. Throughout the story, we can see that Yozo is stuck in a cycle of acting out due to his trauma. This can be seen when he had stated early on in the novel that his life is a life of much shame. Through this sentence alone, we can see that Yozo had failed to contextualize his trauma and understand the external origin in any other way than to blame himself. He is emotionally frozen and never capable of envisioning a future in which there would be no suffering due to his trauma. His retrospective narrative is nothing akin to reflection or reinterpretation. He simply criticizes himself and his despair through the blunt admission. Lastly is the analysis based on testimony, silence, and fragmented narration. As we know, trauma testimony is necessarily fragmented due to the trauma overwhelming the mind's ability to weave a narrative into a form. This could be seen in Yozo's notebook, which illustrates this broken testimony. His narrative isn't seen as a seamless autobiography, but is treated as a series of fragmented entries framed by external commentary and photographs that are interpreted by others. This framing highlights Yozo's inability to fully capture his personal experience. The cruelest moments, such as the sexual abuse, suicide attempts, and emotional collapse, are punctuated by ellipses, sudden transition, and emotional bluntness.
In conclusion, this study applies trauma theory to No Longer Human to show that Obayosu's alienation, self-destructive behavior, and fragmented identity are consequences of unresolved trauma. Yozo's suffering is not merely personal failure, existential despair, or social maladjustment, but a psychological response to an assimilated traumatic experience. His declaration of being no longer human reflects trauma, disruption of memory, selfhood, and human connection. Next, using trauma theory, this study draws on several theories to explain this process. Katie Carrot explains how Yozo's trauma remains emotionally inaccessible and returns through dissociation, numbness, and shame. Freud and Lacapra show that Yozo is trapped in cycle of repetition, where his self-destructive actions function as acting out rather than working through trauma. Next, Feldman and Laub explain how the fragmented structure of the novel reflects incomplete testimony, showing that trauma resists clear language and meaning. Overall, No Longer Human can be read as literary testimony to trauma, presenting Yozo not as a failed human being, but as a tragic figure shaped by psychological injury.